Polaris 850's engine coughed like Dad's old Buick used to. Not good when you're 60 miles out on ice roads that weren't properly maintained since the state cut the budget again. Jonas Mercer downshifted, feeling the track bite into what looked like solid pack, but could be overflow waiting to swallow a sled whole. 23 years guiding tourists and search and rescue ops through Alaska's backcountry, and he still got that gut twist when the machine started acting up this far from civilization. "Come on, sweetheart," he muttered, patting the handlebars like Sarah used to hate, talking to machines instead of people, she'd said. Right before the divorce papers. Right before she took Emma to Seattle because Alaska's no place to raise a daughter. Maybe she wasn't wrong, but it was the only place Jonas knew how to breathe. The radio crackled. "Ranger Station 7, this is dispatch. We've got a situation developing near Anchorage. You copy?" Jonas thumbed the mic, eyes scanning the white expanse ahead. The aurora was starting early tonight, green ribbons dancing across stars that looked close enough to touch. Light shimmered off every metallic surface of the sled, turning the handlebars into twisted mirrors that fractured his vision. "Copy, dispatch. Go ahead. Major seismic event, 9.1 magnitude, epicenter 12 miles northeast of the city. Multiple facilities reporting structural damage. We're getting some weird reports from the University Research Complex." The sled hit a pressure ridge wrong, and Jonas felt his kidneys rearrange themselves. He'd been meaning to replace those shocks for 3 months now, same way he'd been meaning to call David for 6 months, ever since their last conversation had ended with him hanging up when his brother started talking about breakthrough research. Another broken promise to add to the collection. Dad's voice echoed in his memory. "Look after your little brother, Jonas. He's got book smarts but no street sense." Deathbed promises were supposed to mean something, but Jonas had gotten tired of trying to connect with someone who lived in laboratories and spoke in technical jargon he'd never understand. What kind of weird reports? He was still 40 miles from his turnaround point, but something in the dispatcher's voice made his shoulders tighten. After 2 decades in search and rescue, you learn to hear the spaces between words. Possible biohazard at the cryogenic research facility. Multiple casualties, unknown pathogen. States mobilizing hazmat teams, but the roads are pretty torn up. They're asking for anyone with backcountry access to maintain perimeter until morning. Jonas pulled the Polaris to a stop, engine idling rough in the -30 air. The aurora pulsed overhead, reflecting off the snow in patterns that made his eyes water. Every piece of metal on the sled, the exhaust, the windscreen, his rifle barrel, caught the light and threw it back in fractured, prismatic flashes that made the landscape look like it was breaking apart and reassembling itself. "You said the university complex?" His breath fogged the helmet visor as he spoke. "That's affirmative. The underground labs took some damage. Listen, Jonas, they've got a list of personnel who might be trapped down there. Your brother's name came up." The world got very quiet except for the Polaris rattling and the wind picking up from the north. Jonas stared at the GPS display. 47 miles to the facility if he cut across Lake Mantanuska, 63 if he took the safe route around. The aurora's reflection on the screen made the digital readout shimmer like water, numbers warping and bending until he had to blink hard to read them clearly. Dad's voice again. "Promise me, son. David's all the family you'll have left." And Jonas had promised, sitting in that hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and defeat, watching the man who'd taught him to track and hunt and survive Alaska's wilderness waste away to nothing. But promises were easy to make when death was abstract, harder to keep when your little brother became a stranger who spoke in scientific terms and made you feel stupid every time you tried to have a normal conversation. How long ago was the quake? 4 hours, 17 minutes. Rescue teams can't get through until dawn at earliest, maybe longer if the aftershocks keep coming. Jonas pulled off his helmet, ran a gloved hand through hair that was more gray than brown now. The cold bit his scalp immediately, but he needed to think without that damn visor turning the world into a funhouse mirror. The aurora twisted overhead, casting green light that made everything look frozen in time. The snow, the trees, his own hands on the handlebars. For a moment, he could swear the light was forming patterns, shapes that looked almost like... He blinked hard, forced his focus back to the radio. Hypothermia played tricks with perception, made you see things that weren't there. And he wasn't hypothermic, not yet. "Dispatch, I'm approximately 47 miles southeast of the facility. I can be there in 2 hours if conditions hold." "Negative, Ranger 7. Orders are to maintain perimeter, not approach." Hazmat protocols are in effect. Jonas was already turning the sled around, checking his gear bag out of habit. Emergency beacon, first aid kit, survival shelter, 3 days of food. The .45-70 lever action strapped to the seat. More for bears than anything else, but Alaska had taught him that sometimes the scariest predators walked on 2 legs. The rifle had been his grandfather's, passed down through 3 generations of men who understood that promises to family meant something, even when keeping them might get you killed. Copy that, dispatch. Maintaining perimeter. He clicked off the radio before they could ask him to confirm his position. The GPS showed his location as a blinking dot in an ocean of white, but Jonas had been reading this country for longer than the satellites had been watching it. The aurora's reflection turned the screen into a kaleidoscope of green and white, numbers fragmenting and reforming like broken glass being shaken in a box. Jonas shook his head, focused on the trail ahead. The light pollution was getting to him. Too much reflected aurora, too many metallic surfaces catching and bouncing the glow until the whole world looked like it was vibrating at the wrong frequency. He pulled the helmet back on, adjusted the visor to cut down on the glare. The engine smoothed out as he hit a good stretch of trail, and he tried not to think about David trapped underground in some laboratory disaster, probably following protocols while the world ended around him. His little brother had always been good at following rules, even as a kid. Jonas was the one who'd broken curfew and skipped school and gotten into fights behind the Chevron station. David was the one who'd reminded him about homework and helped him study for tests, and never once made him feel stupid for not understanding things that came naturally. Until college. Until David started using words Jonas had to look up, started explaining his research in terms that might as well have been a foreign language. Until every conversation became a reminder of all the ways Jonas hadn't lived up to Dad's expectations. The radio crackled again. All units, be advised. Reports of unusual activity near the research facility. Exercise extreme caution. Unknown biological agent may be affecting local wildlife. Jonas reached down and turned off the radio entirely. Whatever was waiting at the end of this ride, he'd face it the way he'd faced everything else for the past 20 years, with his grandfather's rifle and his own stubborn refusal to let Alaska win without a fight. And maybe, if he was lucky, he'd finally keep one of the promises he'd made to his father. The speedometer read 52 miles per hour as he hit the lake ice, engine howling into the wind. Behind him, the aurora twisted like something alive, reflecting off the sled's metal surfaces until his wake looked like a trail of broken mirrors stretching back towards safety. The thing that used to be Dr. Martinez was standing in the middle of the trail when Jonas crested Deadwood Ridge, 20 miles from the facility. It moved like broken glass trying to reassemble itself, jerky, angular motions that didn't flow together the way human movement should. Each step was a separate action, joints bending at wrong angles before snapping back into position with sounds like ice cracking under pressure. Jonas yanked the handlebars left, felt the track lose purchase on a patch of wind-scoured ice, and rode out the skid like he'd done 1,000 times before. When he finally got the machine stopped, he was facing back the way he'd come, helmet visor spiderwebbed from a flying chunk of ice, heart hammering against his ribs. The figure in the lab coat hadn't moved, hadn't even turned toward the noise of the snowmobile, which should have been impossible. But as Jonas watched, Martinez's head rotated toward him with a series of sharp, crystalline movements. Left shoulder, pause, right shoulder, pause, like a mechanism with broken gears trying to find the right angle. He pulled off his helmet, wiped condensation from his eyes. The aurora was bright enough to see details now, reflecting off Martinez's skin in patterns that made Jonas's vision swim. The lab coat was stained dark down the front, but in the shifting green light, the stains looked almost crystalline, like dried blood mixed with frost. Martinez's posture was too rigid, like someone had frozen mid-step and forgot how to move naturally. "Hey!" Jonas called out, voice echoing off the ridgeline. "You okay?" No response. Martinez swayed slightly, and Jonas could hear it now, the sound of ice flexing under stress, tiny fractures opening and closing with each movement. The man's skin had a translucent quality in the aurora light, like he was carved from clouded ice rather than flesh. Jonas reached back for the .45-70, muscle memory from 20 years of backcountry encounters. The metal was so cold it burned through his gloves, and when the aurora flared, the rifle barrel threw back fragmented reflections that made his eyes water. "Dr. Martinez?" He raised his voice, started walking the Polaris closer. "It's Jonas Mercer with Ranger Station 7. Remember me? The figure turned toward his voice with that same broken glass movement, head tilting at an angle that would have snapped a normal person's neck. Martinez's face was blue-white with what looked like severe frostbite, but the patterns in his skin were too geometric, too regular. Like ice crystals had formed just beneath the surface and were growing in perfect mathematical spirals. When Martinez opened his mouth, frost poured out instead of breath. Not normal condensation, actual ice crystals that caught the aurora light and scattered it in prismatic sprays before falling to the snow like tiny mirrors. "Jesus," Jonas whispered, and reached for his radio before remembering he'd turned it off. Martinez took a step forward, then another. Each movement was preceded by the sound of ice breaking. Sharp cracks followed by the wet noise of joints moving through partially frozen tissue. Jonas had seen enough. He turned the Polaris around, aimed it down the backside of Deadwood Ridge, and opened the throttle. Behind him, he heard something that might have been Martinez calling his name, but the voice was wrong, like words formed by wind blowing through ice caves. The trail down the ridge was technical, but Jonas had been running this route since before GPS existed. The speedometer climbed past 60 as he carved through turns that should have been taken at 30. Every piece of metal on the sled, handlebars, exhaust, windscreen, caught the aurora and threw it back in fractured patterns that made the trail look like it was breaking apart ahead of him. His helmet visor had developed a crack from the earlier ice impact, and now his breath was condensing on the inside of the plastic. As he watched, the frost patterns formed shapes that looked almost like letters. DVID spelled out in crystalline formations before his next exhale erased them. Hypothermia, he told himself. Your brain making patterns out of random frost because you're scared and cold and thinking about your brother. But the letters had been too clear, too deliberate. The radio came back on with a burst of static. Multiple contacts reported facility perimeter, unknown pathogen confirmed. He grabbed the mic, keyed it while steering one-handed around a boulder. Dispatch, this is Ranger 7. I've got visual confirmation of affected personnel approximately 20 miles southeast of the facility. Request immediate backup and medical. Static. Then, Ranger 7, confirm your location. You're supposed to be maintaining perimeter. Screw the perimeter. I've got Dr. Martinez from the cryogenics lab exhibiting signs of severe hypothermia and possible psychological disturbance. But he's mobile, which doesn't make sense given the ambient temperature and exposure time. More static. Then a different voice. Ranger 7, describe the subject's condition in detail. Jonas thought about Martinez's crystalline movements, the geometric patterns in his skin, the ice crystals pouring from his mouth like a broken freezer. Severe frostbite with unusual presentation. Subject appears to be experiencing cellular ice formation, but maintaining mobility. Movements are erratic, mechanical. Any signs of aggressive behavior? The question made Jonas's blood feel colder than the air around him. Why would you ask that? A long pause. Then, Ranger 7, we need you to maintain radio contact and continue toward the facility. The biological agent appears to be interacting with the extreme cold conditions in unexpected ways. Jonas crested another ridge and saw the glow of Anchorage in the distance. The facility would be just this side of the city, built into a hillside where the permafrost was stable. The aurora was reflecting off every surface down there, buildings, vehicles, the snow itself, turning the landscape into a maze of fractured light. What kind of biological agent? Experimental cryogenic preservation compound. What we know is that several subjects who were declared deceased during the initial facility breach are now exhibiting signs of mobility. The Polaris hit a patch of overflow, and Jonas felt the track lose traction for a heart-stopping moment. He'd been so focused on the radio conversation that he'd almost missed the danger sign, darker ice, slightly sunken, where warm springs fed the creek below. You're telling me the dead are walking around? We're telling you that the preservation compound interacts with sub-zero temperatures in ways we don't fully understand. The affected subjects appear to be undergoing some form of cryogenic stasis while maintaining basic motor functions. Jonas checked his GPS. The screen was almost unreadable with all the aurora reflection, numbers and grid lines fragmenting into prismatic displays. 37 miles if he stayed on the safe trails, maybe 22 if he cut across Rabbit Lake. 45 minutes if conditions hold. Be advised, we're tracking at least 6 mobile subjects in your vicinity. Maintain distance, do not attempt contact. 6 people moving through the wilderness with crystalline skin and broken glass movements. ice pouring from their mouths as they walked through snow that should have killed them hours ago. Jonas thought about David, trapped underground in a facility that had lost containment, surrounded by whatever had gotten loose from the cryogenic storage. Dispatch, what's the status on personnel inside the facility? Static. The kind that meant someone was deciding how much truth to share. Unknown at this time, Ranger 7. Maintain course and contact. Jonas clicked off the radio and aimed the Polaris toward Rabbit Lake. His breath was fogging the cracked visor again, frost forming in patterns that his brain kept trying to read as letters. He wiped the inside of the helmet and tried to focus on the trail ahead. The aurora was fading now, but its reflection lingered on every metallic surface, creating an afterglow that made distances impossible to judge. His headlight carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, but the beam kept catching ice crystals in the air, not normal snow, but geometric formations that drifted like broken glass. Behind him, 6 people who should have been dead were wandering through country that killed healthy, prepared survivors on a regular basis. Ahead of him, his brother was trapped in a facility that had turned corpses into walking ice sculptures. And Jonas was riding toward both of them on a 20-year-old snowmobile with a cracked helmet visor that kept showing him words spelled in frost, armed with his grandfather's rifle and the weight of every promise he'd failed to keep. The speedometer climbed past 60 as he hit the lake ice, and the sound of the engine mixed with something else, a high, crystalline note that might have been wind through ice formations, or might have been the sound of breaking glass singing in harmony with itself. The facility's emergency lights made the hillside look like a broken kaleidoscope, red strobes reflecting off fresh snow and shattered concrete where the earthquake had split the access road. Every reflection fractured into prismatic sprays that hurt to look at directly. Jonas counted 3 vehicles in the parking area, 2 state hazmat response trucks and David's ancient Subaru, still running with the exhaust creating geometric patterns in the sub-zero air. The sight of his brother's car, engine idling like David might walk out any moment, hit Jonas harder than seeing Martinez transformed on the trail. Dad's voice echoed in his memory. Your brother's got a good heart, but he doesn't understand how dangerous the world can be. You'll need to watch out for him. Another promise Jonas had broken through months of ignored calls and declined dinner invitations. He parked the Polaris behind a concrete barrier, tried to raise someone on the radio. Nothing but static and the occasional burst of official chatter that cut out before he could make sense of it. The facility entrance was a steel door built into the hillside, bunker-style construction designed to survive disasters and contain whatever was inside. The door was standing open, and ice crystals drifted out of the opening like snow, except they moved in patterns too regular, too geometric. When the emergency lighting hit them, they threw back rainbow refractions that made Jonas's eyes water. He pulled the .45-70 from its scabbard, worked the lever to chamber a round. The metal was so cold it burned through his gloves, and when the strobes hit the barrel, the reflections created a stroboscopic effect that made everything seem to move in stop motion. Hello, he called toward the open door. This is Ranger Station 7. Anyone inside? His voice echoed off concrete walls and came back distorted, like sound bouncing through an ice cave. The emergency lighting inside cast everything in harsh LED shadows, but there was something else, a subtle luminescence that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if ice crystals embedded in the concrete were catching and amplifying the light. He keyed his radio. Dispatch, this is Ranger 7 at the facility. Door is compromised, no sign of hazmat personnel. Static. Then, Ranger 7, you are ordered to maintain perimeter. Do not enter the facility. I've got civilian personnel inside, including my brother. Where's your hazmat team? A gravelly voice came on. Ranger, this is Incident Command. Hazmat team went dark 40 minutes ago. We're treating this as a hostile environment. Jonas stared at the open door, thinking about David somewhere inside a facility that had already swallowed a trained response team. His little brother, who'd sent Christmas cards every year even after Jonas stopped responding, who'd called to share excitement about breakthrough research and gotten impatience and hangover irritation instead. How many personnel were inside when containment failed? Classified. Jonas started walking toward the entrance, rifle ready. The closer he got, the more obvious it became that something was wrong with the air itself. Ice crystals were forming and dissolving in patterns that defied physics, creating geometric shapes that lasted just long enough for his brain to recognize them as almost familiar before they dissolved and reformed. Command, I'm going in. Negative. You're not trained for biohazard response. Neither were the people who got trapped in there. Jonas reached the entrance and looked down a corridor that stretched into darkness. The walls were concrete painted institutional green, but the paint seemed to shimmer with embedded ice crystals that caught the emergency lighting and threw it back in fractured patterns. I've got search and rescue training and 23 years of getting people out of bad situations. Plus I know Dr. David Mercer personally. He's my brother. Silence on the radio. Jonas didn't wait for permission. He stepped into the corridor and immediately understood why the hazmat team had gone dark. The air itself was wrong. Too thick, too cold, filled with crystalline formations that moved like living things. Every breath created frost patterns on his visor that looked like words, like messages, like warnings spelled out in ice. Ranger 7, be advised. The cryogenic preservation compound appears to interact with organic tissue in the presence of extreme cold. Affected subjects show no response to pain, exhibit mechanical movement patterns, and demonstrate significant physical durability. A sound echoed from deep in the facility, not quite human, like air being forced through damaged vocal cords filled with ice. It was followed by the distinctive crack shuffle of footsteps that moved like breaking glass trying to walk. Jonas moved down the corridor, rifle at the ready. The emergency lighting made his shadow dance on the walls, and every few seconds the strobes outside would flash red through the entrance, turning everything the color of frozen blood. The first body was 20 feet in, wearing a sealed hazmat suit that had been torn open from the inside. The suit's material looked like it had been flash frozen and then shattered, leaving edges sharp as glass. There was no head visible through the faceplate, just crystalline formations that might have been ice, or might have been what was left of someone's skull after rapid cellular freezing. Jonas knelt next to the suit, found the name tag, Torres. The radio was still clipped to the belt, crackling with static. He tried to turn it on, but the electronics were encased in ice crystals that had grown through the circuit board like cancer. Command, I've got visual on one of your hazmat personnel. Kia, suit compromised. Cause of death appears to be rapid cellular freezing from the inside out. Copy. Continue reporting. Jonas stood up, wiped ice from his gloves. The corridor stretched ahead, with doorways branching off and more emergency lighting creating a maze of shadows and reflections. According to the facility map David had shown him during that tour 3 years ago, the cryogenic storage was on the lower level. Movement in the shadows ahead, something pale and upright, moving with that same broken glass gait he'd seen from Martinez. Jonas raised the rifle, peered into the darkness beyond the emergency lighting. David, he called out. David, it's Jonas. Are you okay? The movement stopped, then started again, faster now, accompanied by the sound of ice cracking and reforming with each step. Jonas centered the rifle's sights on the approaching figure, finger on the trigger, but not quite ready to fire. The figure stepped into the emergency lighting, and Jonas's heart stopped. It was wearing David's clothes, the same flannel shirt and jeans from their last dinner together 6 months ago. But everything else was wrong. The skin had that same translucent, crystalline quality he'd seen in Martinez. The movements were mechanical, joints bending at angles that would have broken bone, but somehow held together by ice formations that had replaced normal tissue. David! Jonas's voice cracked. His brother turned toward the sound, and Jonas saw the wound in his throat, a jagged tear that went from ear to collarbone, but instead of blood, there were ice crystals growing from the edges like frozen flowers. David's mouth opened and closed, and crystalline formations poured out instead of words, catching the emergency lighting and scattering it in prismatic sprays. Jonas kept the rifle trained on his brother's chest and tried to find words for what he was seeing. David was supposed to be the smart one, the one who'd understood science and technology and how to make the world better. He wasn't supposed to be standing in a dark hallway with ice crystals growing from his throat, moving like a broken marionette held together by frozen tissue. Command, Jonas whispered into the radio. I've got visual on Dr. David Mercer. He's been affected by the preservation compound. Static. Then, confirm status, Ranger 7. Jonas looked at his brother, at the thing that had been his brother, and tried to find clinical terms for the impossible. David took another step forward, arms reaching out in a gesture that might have been affection if his joints hadn't moved with the sound of breaking ice. Subject is mobile but non-responsive. Significant trauma to neck and throat area, but wounds appear to be preserved rather than healing. Tissue shows signs of crystalline formation. Doesn't appear to recognize me. Ranger 7, maintain distance and avoid physical contact. David was 10 feet away now, close enough that Jonas could see his breath creating geometric frost patterns in the air. Which didn't make sense, because if the preservation compound had killed him, there shouldn't be any breathing. Unless the extreme cold was maintaining just enough biological function to keep basic systems running while everything that made David human was gone. Jonas backed up a step, rifle still aimed at his brother's chest. "David, I need you to stop right there. Please. I don't want to hurt you." David kept walking. His face showed no recognition, no understanding, just that same mechanical persistence Jonas had seen in Martinez. Ice crystals were growing from his skin now, forming geometric patterns that caught the emergency lighting and threw it back in fractured rainbows. Dad's voice echoed in Jonas's memory. "Promise me you'll look after him." And Jonas had promised, sitting in that hospital room, watching the man who'd taught him to track and hunt waste away to nothing. But he'd broken that promise through months of silence, through calls not returned and invitations declined, through letting pride and resentment build walls between them that could never be torn down now. Jonas's finger tightened on the trigger, and for the first time in his life, he genuinely didn't know if he was strong enough to do what needed to be done. The emergency lighting flickered, casting David's crystalline features in shifting patterns of shadow and light, and for just a moment, Jonas could swear he saw something human flicker behind those ice-covered eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to David and to Dad and to every promise he'd ever broken. "I'm so goddamn sorry." The shot echoed through the concrete corridors like thunder, and David, the thing that had been David, staggered backward but didn't fall. The .45-70 round had punched through his chest. Jonas could see the hole in the flannel shirt, but his brother kept walking forward with the same mechanical persistence. Ice crystals were already forming around the wound, sealing it with geometric precision. Jonas worked the lever action, chambered another round, and tried to process what he'd just witnessed. The preservation compound wasn't just keeping tissue alive, it was restructuring it, turning flesh and bone into something that functioned like living crystal. David's movements became more erratic after the chest shot, joints clicking and crackling as ice formations shifted to compensate for the damage. "Head shot," Jonas whispered to himself, remembering basic anatomy from his search and rescue training. "Destroy the brainstem, stop the motor functions." He raised the rifle, sighted on his brother's forehead, and found that his hands were shaking. Not from the cold, he'd been colder than this plenty of times, but from the simple impossibility of what he was about to do. This was David, who'd followed him through the woods as a kid, who'd helped him with homework and reminded him about chores and never once made him feel stupid for not understanding things that came naturally. David's mouth opened, and instead of words, a stream of ice crystals poured out, forming patterns in the air that looked almost like letters. JONAS spelled out in frozen formations before dissolving and reforming into other shapes, other almost words that Jonas's brain kept trying to read as messages. "I know you're in there somewhere," Jonas said, voice barely above a whisper. "And I know I was a shitty brother, but I can't let you suffer like this." He pulled the trigger. The second shot took David's head apart, but not the way a bullet normally would. Instead of blood and tissue, there was an explosion of ice crystals that caught the emergency lighting and scattered it in prismatic sprays across the corridor walls. David's body collapsed like a marionette with cut strings, but the crystalline formations that had held him together didn't disappear. They continued to move for several seconds, growing across the floor in geometric patterns before finally going still. Jonas stood there for a long moment, rifle smoking in the cold air, staring at what was left of his brother. The ice crystals were still catching the light, creating rainbow patterns that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. The radio crackled. "Ranger 7, report status." Jonas keyed the mic with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "Threat neutralized. Continuing search for survivors." He stepped over the crystalline remains and tried not to think about David's last Christmas card, sitting unopened on his kitchen table for 3 months because Jonas had been too proud and resentful to read his little brother's holiday wishes. The corridor continued deeper into the facility, emergency lighting creating a maze of shadows and reflections off the ice formations that seemed to be growing from the walls themselves. The stairwell to the lower levels was just ahead, marked with warning signs about biological hazards and temperature controls. Voices echoed up from below, definitely human, definitely alive. Jonas started down the stairs, rifle ready. The air was warmer here, maybe 40 degrees instead of sub-zero, but filled with a mist that created rainbow patterns in his flashlight beam. "Hello," he called down. "This is Ranger Station 7. Anyone down there need assistance? Up here. We're trapped in the storage area. The first basement level was lined with heavy steel doors, most standing open to reveal laboratory spaces filled with equipment that hummed with electrical current. Ice crystals covered every surface, growing in patterns too regular to be natural. Down here, the voice came from the end of the corridor, where a door marked cryogenic storage stood partially open. Light spilled through the gap, warm yellow instead of the harsh LED emergency lighting. Jonas approached carefully. 3 people were huddled near the back of the storage room, 2 young researchers and an older security guard. All 3 looked exhausted but human. No crystalline skin, no mechanical movements, no ice pouring from their mouths when they spoke. "Thank God," the security guard said. "We've been hearing gunshots and screaming for hours. What's happening up there?" Jonas lowered the rifle slightly. "Biological containment failure. The preservation compound is interacting with the cold to reanimate deceased tissue. The facility's been evacuated." One of the researchers, a young woman with short dark hair, stood up. "Dr. Martinez? Dr. Patel? Dr. Mercer?" Jonas thought about Martinez on the trail, about David's crystalline remains in the corridor upstairs. "I'm sorry. The compound appears to be 100% fatal, but it preserves motor function through ice crystal formation. Are any of you showing symptoms?" The security guard shook his head. "We sealed ourselves in here when the power went out. The temperature's been stable, and the air filtration should have kept the compound from getting in." Jonas looked around the storage room, taking in the rows of tall cylindrical tanks that reached from floor to ceiling. Most were still functioning, maintaining sub-zero temperatures, but several had failed and were leaking the preservation compound in crystalline clouds. "What exactly were you people working on down here?" The other researcher, a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, answered. "Experimental tissue preservation at extreme temperatures. The goal was to extend the viability of organ transplants by inducing controlled crystallization of cellular structures. You were turning people into living ice sculptures." "That's oversimplified, but..." The young man's voice trailed off as he realized the implications. "The process was supposed to be reversible. We could preserve subjects at temperatures that would normally cause cellular damage, then revive them with full neurological function." Jonas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And did it work?" "Partially. We could preserve the subjects and maintain basic motor functions, but the neurological revival was incomplete. Higher brain function was severely compromised, but the subjects showed responses to stimuli and could perform simple movements. So you created a process that preserves bodies but destroys minds." "The earthquake damaged the containment systems," the security guard said. "Multiple tank failures, preservation compound released into the facility atmosphere. We sealed ourselves in here and waited for help." "How many test subjects are we talking about?" The 3 survivors exchanged glances. Finally, the young woman answered, 47 animal subjects plus tissue samples from approximately 200 human cadavers donated for research." Jonas stared at her. 200 human subjects. Samples. But yes, if the preservation compound was released into the facility atmosphere and mixed with the sub-zero outside temperatures, it could crystallize any organic tissue it came into contact with. Jonas finished the thought, understanding now why the hazmat team had gone dark. "How do we contain it?" The security guard pulled a key card from his uniform. "Emergency sterilization protocol. Sodium hypochlorite flood system designed to break down organic compounds. But it has to be activated manually from the control room on this level." "Where's the control room?" "End of the corridor, past the laboratories where most of the specimens were stored." The guard's voice was grim. "And based on what you've described, that's probably where most of them are now." Jonas checked his rifle, 2 rounds left, plus a spare box in his pack. Not much ammunition for fighting through a facility full of crystallized research subjects, but it would have to do. "Can the system be activated remotely?" "Manual activation only. Someone has to physically go to the control room and turn the key." Jonas thought about the hazmat team that had gone dark, about David's ice crystal remains, about the geometric patterns the preservation compound created as it restructured living tissue, about Dad's deathbed promise and all the ways he'd failed to keep it. "All right," he said. "You 3 stay here. Keep this door sealed until you hear the all clear. I'm going to try to reach the control room." The security guard handed him the key card and a heavy-duty flashlight. "If you don't make it back, how long can we survive in here?" Emergency systems should keep the temperature stable for maybe 12 hours, the young woman answered. After that, the remaining tanks will start warming up, and any specimens still in storage will begin to thaw and reanimate. Jonas headed for the door, paused, looked back. For what it's worth, I don't think any of you meant for this to happen. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. We thought we were helping people. Organ transplants, treating degenerative diseases. We never imagined. David thought he was helping people too, Jonas said. But right now, I need to clean up the mess before it spreads beyond this facility. The corridor outside was darker than he remembered, emergency lighting flickering as the backup power drained. Ice crystals covered every surface now, growing in geometric patterns that reflected the dying lights in fractured rainbows. Jonas could hear movement from the laboratory section, the crack shuffle of crystallized tissue learning to walk, the sound of ice formations breaking and reforming with each mechanical step. The first specimen he encountered had been a dog, based on the general shape and size. The preservation compound had turned its fur into delicate crystal formations that chimed like wind chimes when it moved. It stood motionless in the middle of a laboratory, head tilted at an unnatural angle, listening to something Jonas couldn't hear. When it turned toward his flashlight beam, its eyes reflected the light like prisms, scattering rainbow patterns across the walls. Jonas raised the rifle, sighted on the thing's head, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the laboratory, and the crystallized dog exploded into geometric fragments that continued to catch and scatter light even as they fell to the floor. One round left in the chamber, 6 more in his pack, and God knew how many more specimens between him and the control room. He reloaded quickly, muscle memory from decades of hunting taking over. The control room was maybe 50 yards through this maze of laboratories, and whatever else was wandering around down here. The flashlight beam cut through air thick with crystalline formations, and every few seconds he'd catch sight of something pale and upright at the edge of his vision. The next specimen had been human, a middle-aged man in hospital scrubs, probably one of the organ donors. The preservation process had left his skin translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface like a road map traced in ice. When he moved, it was with that same broken glass gait, joints bending at impossible angles before snapping back into position with sounds like icicles breaking. Jonas didn't hesitate this time. Headshot, reload, keep moving. The crystalline remained scattered light in prismatic patterns as they hit the floor. The control room door was visible now, maybe 20 yards ahead, but between him and the entrance were at least 6 more specimens, humans and animals in various states of preservation, all moving with that same mechanical shuffle. Their crystalline skin caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in fractured patterns that made Jonas's eyes water. 2 rounds left in the rifle, 6 in his pack. Not enough for a sustained fight, but maybe enough if he was smart about it. Jonas pulled one of the emergency flares from his pack, ignited it, and threw it toward the far end of the laboratory. The red chemical light filled the corridor, and every crystalline surface became a mirror, multiplying the glow until the entire space looked like the inside of a kaleidoscope. The specimens turned toward the light with mechanical precision, shuffling away from Jonas and toward the flare like plants seeking the sun. He used the distraction to reach the control room door, swiped the key card, and slipped inside. The control room was cramped, filled with monitors and switches that controlled the facility's various systems. Most of the screens were dark, but the emergency sterilization panel was still powered, protected by a clear plastic cover marked with warnings in 3 languages. Jonas lifted the cover, found the activation key, and turned it. Warning lights began flashing, and a recorded voice echoed through the facility. Emergency sterilization protocol activated. All personnel evacuate immediately. Chemical flood commencing in 60 seconds. He keyed his radio. Command, this is Ranger 7. Emergency sterilization activated. Facility will be flooded with sodium hypochlorite in 1 minute. Copy, Ranger 7. Evacuate immediately. Jonas looked at the countdown display, 45 seconds and ticking down. The control room door had automatically sealed as part of the sterilization protocol, and the only way out was back through the laboratory section he'd just cleared. Through specimens that were probably moving back toward the control room now, drawn by the warning lights and announcement. 30 seconds. Jonas chambered his last round and opened the door. The chemical flood hit the facility like a breaking wave, white foam pouring from ceiling vents and floor drains, filling the corridors with the sharp smell of industrial bleach. Jonas ran through it, boots splashing in the rising tide, as the sodium hypochlorite ate through everything organic it touched. Behind him, the crystallized specimens were dissolving, not dying because they'd already been dead, but breaking down into constituent elements that would never threaten anyone again. The geometric ice formations that had covered the walls began to fracture and dissolve, their prismatic light shows fading as the chemical flood neutralized the preservation compound. What had been beautiful in its alien way was reduced to simple chemistry, carbon and hydrogen and oxygen rearranging themselves into harmless compounds. He made it to the storage room just as the security guard was sealing the door against the chemical flood. The 3 survivors were wearing emergency breathing masks, but Jonas could see relief in their eyes as he stumbled into the room, soaked with sterilization chemicals and exhausted in ways that went deeper than physical fatigue. "Is it over?" the young woman asked, voice muffled by the mask. Jonas nodded, not trusting his voice. Outside, the facility was being systematically sterilized, every trace of the biological agent neutralized by chemistry that would render the underground complex uninhabitable for months. David's crystalline remains were dissolving along with everything else, which felt both wrong and somehow appropriate. A scientific solution for someone who'd dedicated his life to scientific research. The radio crackled. "Ranger 7, report status." "Facility secured," Jonas said. 3 survivors in the storage area, ready for evacuation. "The preservation compound has been neutralized." "Copy that. Evacuation teams are en route." ETA 15 minutes. Jonas sat down on a crate of laboratory supplies and tried to process what had happened. 8 hours ago, he'd been running his regular patrol route, worried about engine trouble and heating bills. Now he was sitting in a cryogenic storage facility while chemical foam dissolved his brother's body somewhere above them, having killed the only family he had left in the world. But David had been gone the moment the preservation compound reached him, transformed into something that moved like broken glass and breathed ice crystals instead of air. Shooting him had been a mercy, not murder, though Jonas suspected the distinction wouldn't matter much to the guilt that was already settling into his bones like winter cold. The security guard handed him a bottle of water and an emergency blanket. "You did what had to be done," he said quietly. "Whatever was walking around up there, it wasn't really them anymore." Jonas knew that, had seen the way the compound restructured living tissue into crystalline formations, turning flesh and bone into something that functioned like living ice. But understanding the science didn't make the emotional reality any easier to bear. The young woman sat down next to him. "Dr. Mercer, your brother, he volunteered for the overnight shift because he wanted to monitor the new preservation protocols personally. He was always careful about safety procedures, always put other people's welfare first." Jonas thought about David's last voicemail, about the excitement in his voice when he'd talked about breakthrough research that could save lives, about how Jonas had been too hungover and resentful to call him back, too proud to admit he might want to hear what his little brother was working on. "He talked about you," she continued. "Showed us pictures from search and rescue operations. He was proud of what you did, helping people in dangerous situations." That hit harder than seeing David's crystallized remains. His brother had been proud of him, even though Jonas had spent years being too stubborn to maintain their relationship. It didn't fix anything, wouldn't bring David back or undo the months of ignored calls, but it was something, a small piece of grace in a situation that felt entirely graceless. The evacuation team arrived in full hazmat suits, leading the 4 survivors through corridors that reeked of chemicals and dissolution. The facility would be sealed permanently, they were told, buried under concrete and classified as an environmental hazard. The research would be discontinued, the preservation compound destroyed, the whole project erased from the official record. Jonas rode back to Anchorage in a state emergency vehicle, watching the aurora dance across the sky through windows that were finally warm enough to see through clearly. The lights looked different now, less like broken glass, more like the natural phenomenon he'd grown up with. The preservation compound was gone, and with it, the strange effects it had created on light and perception. The driver tried to make conversation about what had happened. "Must have been intense down there, fighting those frozen zombie things." "They weren't zombies," Jonas replied. "They were people who deserved better than what happened to them." The driver fell silent, and Jonas spent the rest of the ride thinking about David's Christmas cards and unanswered phone calls, about Martinez wandering through the wilderness in surgical scrubs, about the graduate students who'd spent hours trapped in a storage room wondering if the world was ending. Back in Anchorage, Jonas spent 3 days being debriefed by federal agents who asked the same questions repeatedly. What did you see? What did you do? Are you experiencing any symptoms? He answered honestly, submitted to blood tests and psychological evaluations, signed documents preventing him from discussing the incident for 20 years. On the 4th day, he drove David's Subaru back to his cabin. The state had impounded it as evidence, then released it to next of kin along with David's personal effects. The car smelled like his brother's aftershave and contained the accumulated debris of a busy life. Coffee cups, gas receipts, a book about tissue preservation bookmarked 3/4 through. There was also a voicemail on David's phone, recorded 2 days before the earthquake. Jonas almost deleted it without listening, but curiosity won. Hey Jonas, it's me. I know you're probably busy, but I wanted to tell you about something we've been working on. We think we might have solved the cellular damage problem in cryogenic preservation, could revolutionize transplant surgery, help people waiting for compatible organs. I know you think what I do is pretty abstract, but this could actually save lives. Real people, you know. Anyway, call me back when you get a chance. I'd love to explain it over dinner. Jonas played the message 3 times, then saved it. David's enthusiasm was infectious even in death, the same excitement he'd shown as a kid when he figured out how something worked. It didn't undo the months of ignored calls, but it reminded Jonas of who his brother had been before the compound turned him into something that needed to be destroyed. He spent the next week arranging David's funeral, a small service at the Methodist church their parents had attended. Maybe 20 people showed up, colleagues from the university, a few neighbors, the 3 survivors from the facility who'd driven up to pay their respects. Jonas spoke briefly about David's dedication to helping others, but didn't mention the facility or what had happened in those frozen corridors. Some truths were too dangerous to share, and Alaska had always been good at keeping secrets. After the funeral, Jonas returned to his regular patrol routes, checking remote cabins and maintaining trail markers. The work was the same, but everything felt different. Every emergency call carried the possibility of impossible choices, of ordinary people transformed into something that needed to be stopped rather than saved. But he kept doing the work anyway, because that's what David would have wanted. Jonas using his skills to help people in dangerous situations, being the kind of brother who showed up when needed. It wouldn't fix their relationship or bring David back, but it was something. A way of honoring his memory that felt more honest than flowers on a grave. 3 months later, Emma called from Seattle. His daughter, now 22 and working as a pediatric nurse, wanted to know if Uncle David had really died in a laboratory accident. It's complicated, Jonas told her, which was both true and completely inadequate. Mom said you haven't been returning her calls. Jonas looked out the cabin window at snow that was starting to melt, revealing the brown grass of another Alaskan spring. I've been processing some things. David's death wasn't what anyone expected. Do you want to talk about it? The question carried years of distance and missed opportunities. Jonas thought about David's voicemail, the pride in his voice when he'd talked about saving lives, the way he'd looked standing in that corridor with crystalline skin and empty eyes. Maybe, he said finally, but not over the phone. If you want to visit this summer, I'd like that. I'd like to tell you about your uncle, about who he really was. I'd like that too, Dad. After Emma hung up, Jonas sat in his kitchen drinking coffee and thinking about the future. David was gone, dissolved in chemical foam and buried under concrete, but the impulse behind his work, helping people, saving lives, pushing boundaries that could continue. Maybe not with cryogenic preservation, but the desire to help was still there. And Jonas was still alive, still capable of making better choices. Still able to answer the phone when people called, still able to show up when needed. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was something like hope. Outside, the aurora was starting early again, green light dancing across the sky. Jonas watched it through his kitchen window and tried not to think about ice crystals and prismatic reflections. Instead, he thought about Emma's voice on the phone, David's enthusiasm for his research, the possibility that tomorrow might be different than yesterday. Alaska didn't care about human plans or regrets, but it also didn't prevent them. The country was still dangerous, still indifferent to human weakness, still capable of killing the unprepared. But it was also still beautiful, still worth protecting, still home to people who needed help when things went wrong. Jonas finished his coffee and started planning Emma's visit, thinking about all the stories he could tell her about David, their childhood adventures, their shared love of this harsh landscape, the different ways they'd both chosen to help people. Most of the stories would be true, and the ones that weren't could stay buried under concrete where they belonged. The aurora faded as dawn approached, and Jonas began another day of being the kind of brother David would have been proud of. Not perfect, but present and ready to help when the next call came in. Some promises were too important to break twice.